As for the Northern strategy, as we said, we don't belabor a lot of bullets and bombs. We're going to talk more about causes and consequences and changes. There's 3 central battles we'll talk about. We can squeeze in a 4th. We'll talk really quick about Bull Run. The first battle of the war convinces both sides that the war is not going to necessarily be short or quick or easy. Bull Run's a huge defeat for the North, but it strengthens Northern resolve to actually get rid of their illusions about it being a short war. And in the short run, it actually hurts the South because the South, after the victory, does think it'll be easy, and they underestimate the Northern ability to reach into the depths of their gut and kind of, do what needs to be done to mobilize themselves and go on a total war footing. Otherwise, there's 3 central battles of this war that we'll talk about: Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg. Two of the three, Antietam and Gettysburg, represent Southern defeats in attempts to bring the war north. And this gets into a change in strategy that we need to discuss. When the war began, the South felt that the longer the war went on, the better it was. Only as the war began to go on did the Southerners begin to realize that the longer this war goes on, it actually is a detriment to the South. And to think about why, going back to our maps again, the Union blockade was hardly effective on day 1 of the war. The Union blockade was leaky, largely ineffective. It took time, first of all, to deploy the ships, to build the ships necessary, and then get all the sailors necessary to make the blockade a truly effective instrument of war. Secondly, we hinted at this earlier, all the Northern advantages in industry and economy and population, just because the North has more people than the South and outnumbers them, doesn't mean those people are all trained to be good soldiers within 6 days of the war beginning. It takes time to train and build a military force. It takes time to equip that military force. It takes time to convert all that vast Northern economic horsepower into the things that you need for the tools of war. So it's not quite as simple and clear-cut as the North has all these resources, so they win right away. Northern advantages took time to actually come into the field. But as time goes by, the South begins to discover that, yes, the Northern advantages are bringing more weight onto them in a way that they can't really sustain in the long term. It's in these 2 instances, one in 1862 and one in 1863, that the South decides to bring the war north. In 1862, the first attempt is at Manassas or Antietam, where Robert E. Lee attempts to swing up towards Washington to try to force a defeat and perhaps force Lincoln to peace terms. The battle is essentially a tie. It's a draw. But since he's in foreign country, or as a Union country, Lee can't stay where he is, so he has to leave the battlefield. So tactically, it's a tie. It winds up being a strategic victory for the North. The South has to withdraw. Lincoln uses this as the pretext to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, but more on that in a moment. The second instance is a year later. In the summer of 1863, the South decides to bring the war north again. And when it does, this is irony as well, every time, the 2 major times the South goes north, they find out what the North has found out this entire war. Attack is harder than defense. Attacking an enemy country is harder than defense. And every time Lee goes over to the offensive, General Lee, commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia for the Confederacy, every time he goes over the offensive, all the problems that the North had, they become his problems. And all the advantages that the South had become Northern advantages. Because now the North's on the defensive. The North is dug in. The North has the friendly population around him. The North has the shorter supply lines. So Lee has all those same issues once he goes north. When he attacks at Gettysburg and suffers a crushing defeat, it doesn't destroy his force, but it blunts the instrument, the Army of Northern Virginia. It's the last major opportunity the South has militarily to conquer a peace, to conquer a victory. It doesn't mean the war's over. The war's going to go on two more long, messy, bloody years. But it does mean from this point forward, the strength of Union resources getting greater is going to grind down the South and make the inevitable conclusion, which will be Southern defeat. On the same day that Lee begins his withdrawal from Gettysburg, July 4th, 1863, ironic date, on that same date, a major event on the western frontier takes place with the capture of Vicksburg by Union forces. Union forces had been working down from the north and up from the south, working their way up the river till they got to Vicksburg. Vicksburg was the last Confederate holdout on the Mississippi River. With its fall, Part 2 of the Anaconda Plan is in place. The South is sliced in half. And so these 3 battles and conflicts, or these 3 battles, lead then to the final military tactic I want to talk about, which relates to another slide, the concept of total war. As the war enters its 4th year, General William Sherman takes his troops and leaves Chattanooga, slices through the heart of the South on what is known as the March to the Sea. This is what is called total war. He doesn't kill civilians, doesn't commit genocide, but everywhere he goes on a front that's 60 miles wide, it's like a giant combine mowing down corn. He burns houses to the ground, destroys factories, farms, and shops. Any animals he uses for his own forces he needs, he kills the rest. Any food he uses for his own forces, he destroys the rest. His idea was to make it impossible for the South to support their armies in the war effort. If my home's been burned down, I don't know where my next meal's coming from, I'm going to have a hard time giving aid and comfort to the Confederate Army. His reasoning was he could make the war, by waging a hard war quickly, he could actually shorten the war by taking away the South's ability to resist. He said we can't change their minds, but we can take away their ability to do anything about it. In this sense, Sherman foreshadows what all modern 20th century war will be from here forward. So moving on to your next slide then, on domestic issues. Just because the North had all these advantages did not necessarily mean that the war went smoothly from the Northern point of view. In fact, the Northern population was rather divided on the war. There were many white Northerners who would fight to preserve the Union, who would not fight to make this a war to free African Americans. And initially, Lincoln does some extra legal things. And we've talked about this in earlier lessons with Jackson. Hopefully your classes have too. Any time that a president ignores the Supreme Court, it's a big deal because it happens so infrequently. Jackson did it in terms of Cherokee Indian removal. Lincoln does it in terms of the Civil War. In order to defend the Constitution, Lincoln does things that are beyond the Constitution. He breaks laws in order to preserve the law. And as contradictory as that sounds, he argues that these are unusual times. Unusual times call for unusual measures. First of all, he suspends habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is a civil procedure which basically says that you have the right, if detained by law enforcement, you have the right to know why you're being detained and the duration of your detention. What Lincoln was doing is he was rounding up people that had the government round up people that had somewhat Confederate sympathies or pro-Confederate sympathies and detained them without trial and without charge for an indefinite period of time. It's sort of like if the police had arrested you and pulls you over and you say, what am I being held for? And they say, don't worry about it. And you say, when am I getting out? We'll say, we'll let you know. So it's a very major extension of the powers of the state. In ex parte merriment, which is Latin for on part of merriment, Roger Taney, in the decision in 1861, one of his last decisions, argues that this sort of detention is illegal. He says the suspension of habeas corpus is illegal. Lincoln, like Jackson's Indian removal, Lincoln ignores the court. He says, more rogues and scoundrels than good men can get away with habeas corpus. I have to do what I have to do, and continues to do it so. Remember, there are no Supreme Court police. If the government chooses not to listen, if the executive branch chooses not to listen to the Supreme Court, there's very little the Supreme Court can do about it. So these kinds of jailings go on periodically throughout the war. In terms of the Northern public opinion being divided, there was a definite anti-war faction, the Peace Democrats, or so-called Copperheads, who were active throughout the North for the duration of most of the war. These were Northerners who felt that a war to free blacks was not a good thing, who felt that we could preserve the Union by simply letting the South in and keep their old system and be fine, and who thought that they blamed Republicans and their radicalism for why there's ever a war in the first place. And so Lincoln had to deal with them both either by jailing them or dealing with their criticism throughout the time period. In fact, in 1863, there's major riots against the war in New York City because of the draft. Both armies wound up using conscription or military draft at some point in time. It became a class issue because in the North, you could buy your way out of it. It's like a substitution fee. So you heard the phrase, a rich man's war, a poor man's fight. And additionally, you had Northern urban workers, like the Irish and immigrants, who resented the fact that this war was turning into a war to free blacks, whom they saw as people who would simply compete with them for the jobs that were out there in the free market anyway. So you had a space of about a week in New York in 1863, shortly after Gettysburg, where you had mass riots in New York and other major American cities, and federal troops had to be brought in to put these down over the unfairness of the draft, but also the issue of what the war was sort of being fought for. In terms of financing the war, Andrew Jackson kills the U.S. Bank in 1832. Under Abraham Lincoln, that bank, or not that bank, but the National Banking Act, puts the federal government back into the monetary policy business from which it had been removed for the space of about 35 years. The National Bank Act allows the government to issue currency again, and this currency is not all backed by gold. Wars are very expensive, so for the first time in American history, you had the government printing money that was paper money. It's nicknamed greenbacks because it was green ink. It was backed by the ink it was on, as opposed to being able to be convertible for gold. The government increased the money supply by doing this, printing more money. This is inflationary and has drawbacks, but not nearly as much as it did in the South because the North began winning the war and had a stronger economy. The North also issued war bonds to pay for the war and instituted the first income tax, which was of questionable constitutionality. After the war, it went away, and income tax will not be legal again until the 16th Amendment in 1913.